38 years on this bench, and I have witnessed the many faces of arrogance. It wears many masks. Sometimes it is a frantic, stuttering mess. Other times it is a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly silent void. But the most dangerous form of arrogance is the one that walks through my courtroom doors with a designer handbag on its arm, a smirk on its lips, and the absolute, bone-deep conviction that the laws of this land are merely suggestions for the little people. It is an arrogance born of vast wealth, a product of a life where inconvenience has been systematically erased, and where, for the first time in their lives, they are forced to stand in a room where their checkbook holds no power. I have seen men and women who have built empires and those who have merely spent the fruits of their ancestors. I have seen it across every neighborhood, from the crumbling concrete of the inner city to the gilded driveways of the estates that look down upon us all. After nearly 4 decades, I believed I had seen every iteration of human vanity there was. Then, a woman named Eleanor Van Der Hoven walked into my courtroom on a Tuesday morning, and she proved me wrong in a way that I will carry for the remainder of my life. The charge on the docket was petty. It was the kind of bureaucratic nuisance that usually resolves in 15 minutes, a simple obstruction of public infrastructure. On paper, it was a fine. In reality, it was a litmus test for a soul. She entered my courtroom not as a defendant, but as a conqueror. She moved with the unhurried authority of someone who had never been told to wait, never been denied, and never had to account for her time. The silk of her suit, the subtle flash of diamonds, the way she scanned the gallery with the bored detachment of a socialite at an auction, she had no intention of participating in it, was all designed to say one thing: I do not belong here. She didn't stand for the court. She didn't address the bailiff with the respect mandated by law. When the clerk read the charges, her response was not one of concern, but of profound, blistering annoyance. She looked at me, not as a judge, but as a temporary obstacle. "This is a complete waste of my morning," she muttered, loud enough for the gallery to hear. She turned her gaze to me, her eyes hardening. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? Do you have any idea the revenue our firm generates in a single hour? You are a nobody, a relic of a failing system, and you are keeping me from things that actually matter." The courtroom didn't just go quiet, it froze. The bailiff, a man who has heard every insult under the sun, actually paused. For a moment, even the stenographer stopped typing. The silence was absolute. She wasn't just defending her actions, she was attacking the very sanctity of the bench. She was testing the perimeter of her influence, and she was doing it with a smile. She had mistaken my patience for weakness, and in doing so, she had set into motion the collapse of everything she held dear. I watched her, this woman who had never been denied a single desire in her life. She reached into her bag, not to produce the license or registration I had requested, but to retrieve her phone. It was a gold-plated, custom piece of technology, a glowing symbol of the digital empire she and her husband wielded like a scepter. She didn't look at me. She looked at the screen, her thumb swiping with the casual indifference of someone managing a transaction, not a criminal matter. "Mr. Henderson," she said, addressing her attorney without glancing my way, "remind me why we are sitting in this municipal dungeon. Is the fine just a matter of a few zeros? Pay it, get the car, and let's leave. I have a luncheon at the embassy in an hour." The room remained paralyzed. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of disbelief. Even the clerk, a woman who had seen everything, stared at Eleanor with a mix of shock and pity. I didn't bang my gavel. I didn't shout. I simply let her speak, letting her words hang in the air, creating a rope long enough for her to hang herself with. I have learned over 38 years that if you give a person enough rope, they will always find a way to make a noose. "Mrs. Van Der Hoven," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, which is always far more effective than a shout. "You seem to be under the impression that you are in a boardroom. You are not. You are in a court of law, a place where, for the first time in what appears to be a very long time, your husband's net worth is completely irrelevant. Your influence, your social calendar, your embassy luncheons, they stop at that door." She looked up then, and for the first time, she truly looked at me. Her eyes narrowed. There was no fear, not yet. Just a cold, calculated disdain. She stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket, and walked over to the defense table, ignoring the legal protocols entirely. "You talk about the law," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I am the law in every room I walk into. I sustain the infrastructure of this city. I pay for the very lights above your head and the very pension you're counting the days until you collect. You should be thanking me for my time, not questioning it. That was the pivot. That was the moment the ground shifted beneath her designer heels. She had just admitted it, not just the arrogance, but the entitlement that had led to the incident. She hadn't just blocked an ambulance. She had blocked it because she genuinely believed she was above the consequences of doing so. The gallery murmured a low, buzzing sound of collective indignation. It was the sound of a city realizing that the person in front of them saw them not as human beings, but as obstacles to be brushed aside. I leaned forward, clasping my hands. "You pay for the lights?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Let's talk about what you pay for, Mrs. Van Der Hoven. And let's talk about what you think you own." I knew then that she was done. She had revealed her hand, and it was entirely made of paper. She believed the system was hers to command, failing to realize that I am the one who keeps the books in this room. The arrogance that brought her to my bench was the same arrogance that had likely led her to cut corners, ignore safety, and trample on the very people who kept her empire afloat. And I, for one, was about to hold the light to her paper empire and watch it ignite. "Sit down, Mrs. Van Der Hoven," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm that forced her back into her chair more effectively than any bailiff ever could. She looked stunned. For the first time, the realization dawned on her that the room did not obey her. It obeyed the gavel. "You claim to pay for these lights," I continued, pacing slowly from behind the bench. "You believe your tax contributions give you an equity stake in justice itself. Let me correct that misconception. The lights in this room stay on because of the sacrifice of the people you consider small. They stay on because of the taxpayers who, unlike you, don't view the law as an inconvenient suggestion to be bypassed or bought." I picked up the file. I didn't need to look at it. I knew every damning page by heart. "You mentioned your husband's firm. You bragged about the revenue. Let's talk about that revenue. It's interesting how a global empire manages to operate with such profound disregard for the very infrastructure it relies on. You see, when someone like you walks into my courtroom and dismisses a life-or-death emergency as a commotion, it isn't just a lapse in judgment. It is a symptom of a systemic infection." I stopped directly in front of her. She shrank, just a fraction, realizing the air in the room had changed. "You think you are superior because you have never had to wait. But tell me, Mrs. Van Der Hoven, how does it feel to be the first person in this room to have nowhere else to go? To be trapped by the very law you spent years paying others to ignore?" Her eyes darted to her attorney, who was frantically shuffling papers, suddenly looking much less confident than he had 10 minutes ago. She tried to maintain the smirk, but it was trembling. It was the crack in the foundation. She wasn't used to being looked at, really. Looked at not as a socialite, but as a defendant. "I have not finished with you," I added. "Because you see, I don't care about your luncheons. I don't care about your husband's lobbyists. What I care about is the man you left in that ambulance, Michael Torres." I looked toward the back of the gallery. Michael was there, sitting in a wheelchair, his hands resting on his lap. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a CEO. He was a man who had built the very skyline she admired from her penthouse. He spent 30 years building the infrastructure of this state. He doesn't have a gold-plated phone. He has scars. And because you couldn't be bothered to move your vehicle for 4 minutes, he will live with the consequences of your arrogance for the rest of his life. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy with the weight of her own actions. The smirk was gone. In its place was something far more revealing: terror. I walked back to my bench, my footsteps echoing against the mahogany paneling. The silence had taken on a new texture. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of anticipation. I adjusted my robe, not because it was out of place, but because the moment required the weight of the office I held. "You invoked your family's foundation," I said, my voice steady, slicing through the tension. "You used it as a shield, hoping the mention of charity would blind this court to the reality of your conduct. You believed that donating a fraction of your excess wealth to a hospital wing gave you the moral latitude to endanger the lives of the people who actually built that hospital." Eleanor was standing now, clutching the edge of the defense table so tightly her knuckles were white. The mask had finally slipped. Behind the expensive skin care and the perfectly coiffed hair, there was a raw, exposed human being, and she was terrified. "I have done my homework, Mrs. Van Der Hoven," I continued. "I don't just sit here and listen to rhetoric. I read the filings. And what I found in the records of the Van Der Hoven Foundation wasn't a story of generosity. It was a story of accounting tricks. I found 17 federal investigations spanning 5 years, I found environmental violations at your husband's manufacturing plants that were buried under piles of hush money and non-disclosure agreements. I found tax avoidance schemes so intricate that they suggest the only foundation you truly care about is your own net worth. The gallery erupted in a low collective gasp. This wasn't just a traffic ticket anymore. This was the unraveling of a dynasty, and every person in the courtroom could feel the gravity of it. You told me that some people matter more than others, I said, locking eyes with her. You told me that your time is more valuable than a man's life. Well, let us see what the IRS thinks of the value of your tax returns. Let us see what the Department of Justice thinks of the value of your political influence. Her attorney stood up, his face ashen. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the matter of a traffic violation. Sit down, I snapped, the authority of 38 years, silencing him instantly. She opened the door to her character when she claimed she was too important to follow the law. She brought her empire into my courtroom as a defense. Now, that empire is on the table. I reached for the heavy gavel. The wood felt cool and solid in my hand, a grounding force in a world where truth had become a commodity. Mrs. Van Der Hoven, you came here today expecting a rubber stamp. You expected a judge who would be dazzled by the shine of your jewelry and the sound of your name. Instead, you found a judge who knows that the law is not a suggestion, and that justice, when stripped of all its vanity, is the only thing that actually levels the playing field. I looked at the clerk. Prepare the referrals. I want every single transcript, every single statement made in this room today sent to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Internal Revenue Service. If the foundation is a fraud, the public has a right to know. If the taxes were evaded, the public has a right to be paid back. The blood drained from Eleanor's face, leaving her with the complexion of aged parchment. She stood there, swaying slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. For the first time, she wasn't looking at the room, she was looking at the abyss. She reached for her phone again, her fingers fumbling, a pathetic attempt to summon a reality that no longer existed within these four walls. I watched her, my expression neutral. I have seen this 1,000 times the moment the veneer of invincibility shatters. It is always the same, the disbelief, the panic, and finally the desperate clawing need to restore control. She dialed, presumably her husband, her voice a shrill, desperate whisper that cut through the silence of the court. Marcus, do something. She's destroying everything. You have to fix this, now. I did not intervene. I wanted her to hear the silence on the other end of that line, or perhaps the cold, frantic voice of a husband who was already calculating the cost of her mistake. She ended the call, her phone clattering onto the polished wood of the defense table like a discarded trinket. She turned to me, not with the arrogance she had arrived with, but with a hollowed-out look of pure, unadulterated fear. She tried one last time to wield her weapon. You have no idea what you've just done, she said, her voice cracking. My husband, he doesn't just lobby. He owns the people who will be reviewing these documents. You aren't just ruining my life. You're committing professional suicide. You are a small, insignificant woman playing a game you do not understand. I stood up, and for the first time that morning, I walked out from behind the bench. I stopped inches from her. She smelled of expensive perfume and cold sweat. Mrs. Van Der Hoven, I said, leaning in so that only she could hear. You have spent your life believing that everyone has a price. You think because you have a ledger of souls, but you made a fatal error. You walked into a courtroom that doesn't sell. I am not playing a game. I am doing the job I was sworn to do 38 years ago. And if your husband owns the people who will see these files, then I suggest he starts looking for a better lawyer, because the law is the one thing he cannot buy. I turned back to the bailiff. Remove the defendant from my sight. I have seen enough of her character to last a lifetime. The court is adjourned until the paperwork is processed. The bailiff stepped forward, his presence a firm, immovable reminder of the authority she had tried so hard to dismiss. Eleanor looked around the courtroom, realizing that the people she had viewed as scenery were now the only witnesses to her downfall. Her husband was on the phone, her lawyers were panicked, and the woman who had entered like a queen was now being escorted out like a common criminal. The empire wasn't just collapsing, it was burning, and she was the one who had struck the match. The gavel had silenced the room, but the sound seemed to resonate long after I retreated to my chambers. It was not merely the sound of a fine being levied. It was the definitive closing of a chapter on a life lived in a distorted bubble of self-importance. In my years on this bench, I have often pondered at what point a person loses their grip on reality. Is it the acquisition of the first million? The first building with their name etched into the facade? Or is it the slow, insidious moment they realize that the laws written for the public are merely suggestions for them? By the time I reached my desk, the mechanisms of consequence were already in motion. Justice, when applied with the proper force, is not a singular event, it is a cascade. The transcripts of Eleanor's testimony were not merely paperwork, they were a roadmap for federal investigators. When a person of such stature explicitly declares in a court of law that they are more valuable and that their business interests supersede the sanctity of human life, they are essentially handing the authorities the keys to their own kingdom. Within days, the commotion she had so cavalierly dismissed on that Tuesday morning began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just a traffic violation. The IRS does not need much encouragement to look into a foundation that claims charitable deductions while operating with the opacity of a private offshore account. The SEC does not take kindly to assertions of global influence being used to bypass securities laws. It was as if the dam had finally broken. I sat at my desk, reviewing the initial reports of the fallout. The irony was palpable. The very wealth she used to justify her contempt for the ambulance was now the anchor dragging her down. It is a fundamental truth that the arrogant often forget. When you claim to be better than the rules, you are making yourself a target. You are inviting the world to examine your life with a magnifying glass. And when that life is built on a foundation of evasion, intimidation, and a profound moral void, the light of scrutiny is the last thing you want. The media, usually so easily swayed by the glossy exterior of the ultra-wealthy, turned on her with a ferocity that surprised even me. Her own words, "Some people matter more than others," became the headline of every paper from New York to California. It was the distillation of the very thing the public fears most about the elite, the total, clinical removal of empathy. She had tried to treat my courtroom like a stage for her superiority. Instead, she had turned it into an autopsy table where her privilege would be dissected for all to see. The fall was not elegant, it was loud, messy, and entirely of her own making. As I watched the news cycle begin its inevitable grind of outrage, I knew this wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It was about the fragility of power when it is not anchored in the soil of basic human decency. The media frenzy was not merely a reaction, it was a reckoning. In the age of digital immediacy, Eleanor's courtroom arrogance didn't stay behind closed doors. Her dismissive declaration that some people matter more than others became a digital wildfire, igniting a conversation that transcended the local news. It was the specific kind of quote that functions as a clarion call. It was the distillation of the very systemic inequity that people on the ground floor navigate every single day. While the cameras focused on her public image, the quiet, methodical work of the federal government began to turn the screws. The referrals I sent were not suggestions. Within 72 hours, the IRS had mobilized a specialized unit focused on high net worth tax evasion. The Securities and Exchange Commission, previously dormant regarding the Sterling Empire, suddenly found the capacity to prioritize the forensic audit of the Van Der Hoven holding companies. It turns out that when a judge goes on record pointing at a fire, the agencies tasked with extinguishing it can no longer pretend they don't smell the smoke. Her husband, Marcus, who had spent decades insulating himself from the repercussions of his business practices through strategic philanthropy, found that his foundation was now the most radioactive asset in his portfolio. Donor walls across the state began to scrub the Sterling name. Political campaigns, once eager to accept his generous checks, were now rushing to return them, eager to distance themselves from the woman who had effectively become the face of unbridled, toxic privilege. I watched it all from the quietude of my chambers. There is a particular satisfaction in seeing a house of cards fold. It wasn't that the law had suddenly become more potent. It was that the arrogance had finally become too loud to ignore. Power, when wielded with grace and responsibility, can be a stabilizing force. But when wielded as a bludgeon, it eventually attracts the very forces designed to dismantle it. Eleanor was no longer a player in the game. She had become a liability. The people she had once considered small were now the ones providing the tips to investigators, the ones leaking the documents that were once kept under lock and key by high-priced assistants. The hierarchy she had relied upon was inverting. She had treated the world as a mirror for her own greatness, never realizing that mirrors can shatter, and when they do, the jagged edges always cut the person standing closest. She had reached for the shield of her status, only to find it was made of glass. The aftermath was swift and total. The federal investigation tore through the Van Der Hoven empire like a wildfire through dry timber. It wasn't long before the headlines shifted from the courtroom spectacle to the cold, hard reality of criminal indictments. The millions spent on public relations, the curated image of high society charity, and the carefully constructed legal insulation, it all dissolved. The documents I had referred to the authorities were merely the first threads pulled. Once they started, the entire tapestry of her fabricated life came undone. Months later, I saw her again. It wasn't in a courtroom, and she wasn't wearing Hermes. She was standing on the steps of the federal building, dressed in a simple, nondescript coat, waiting for a bus. She looked older, stripped of the armor of wealth that had previously defined her. She saw me, and for a split second, our eyes locked. There was no smirk. There was no arrogance. There was only the weary recognition of someone who had finally looked into the mirror and seen, for the first time, the person standing on the other side. She didn't approach me, and I didn't stop. There was no need for words. She had learned the lesson that the courtroom had set out to teach, not because I commanded it, but because the world had finally insisted upon it. People often ask me why I am so harsh, why I refuse to be charmed by wealth or status. They think it is because I don't like the rich, but that isn't it. It is because I have spent 38 years on this bench watching human beings in their most unguarded, most vulnerable moments. And in those moments, the truth is laid bare. The construction worker, the paramedic, the student, and the billionaire, they are all the same. They all bleed, they all hurt, and they all have the same fundamental worth. When you walk through those doors, you are not a bank balance, you are not a job title. You are a human being, and you have a responsibility to the others who occupy the same space you do. Eleanor Van Der Hoven had to lose everything to learn that. She had to have her empire dismantled brick by brick to understand that when the lights go out and the bank accounts are frozen, all that remains is the character you have built. When people ask me what justice looks like, I don't tell them about fines or jail time. I tell them about that moment of realization, the moment someone stops seeing themselves as the center of the universe and begins to see their neighbors as their equals. That is the only victory worth having in this room. The empire fell, yes, but in its rubble, perhaps, there was the beginning of a person. And after 38 years, I have learned that is the best one can ever hope for.